morning I want to draw our attention to some lessons that we can learn from Joseph. As we consider our own life situations change and things occur which may not be understood in the moment. And yet behind the scenes, God remains in control. Do we believe that? Do we trust it to be the truth? Do we trust it to be so? As I have read and continue to reread the story of the life of Joseph, this is a reality with which we need to come to grips as we see it happening even in the life of Joseph. So let us consider the life of Joseph. Note the wonder of his youth. As we note in Genesis chapter 37, perhaps we might note him as a spoiled brat. He was the tattletale that we see in Genesis 37 and verse 2 as he was giving an ill report about his brothers to his father. We also see that he was the son who was loved more in verse 4. This is where the hate began, which caused them to speak ill of their little brother. Playing favorites is not good parenting. It had happened also in the earlier generation with Jacob and Esau. And here we see it playing out again. But that jealousy continued to grow as things unfolded. And so in Genesis 37, verses 5 through 11, there we read, "Now Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, 'Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf.' His brothers said to him, 'Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?' And so they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, 'Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me.' But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, 'What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the ground before you?' And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind." And so we wonder at his youth, but then wonder at his brothers seeming to desire to rid themselves of this problem child. At first, they had a murderous plot when he was sent to check on how things were going. In Genesis 37, 18 to 20, there we read, "They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. And they said to one another, 'Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams.'" Now we know that Reuben intervened with the plan to rescue him in verses 21 to 22, but they stripped him of his robe and put him in the pit, verses 23 to 24. But then they had a money-making opportunity. Now, turning from first a murderous plot to then a moneymaker in verse 28. "As then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took him to Egypt." And that is where the saga of his life continued. The saga of Joseph's life continued in Egypt, as we see in Genesis 39 to 41, as ultimately he is favorably employed, and then he is falsely accused. As he was taken by these Midianite traders, and then sold to Potiphar. And so we see as he has continued in his employment in Potiphar's household. We read in verses 7 to 18 of chapter 39. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there in the house, she caught him by his garment, and saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand, and fled, and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand, and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household, and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice, and as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me, and fled, and got out of the house." And then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home. And she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." We see that Joseph remained a man of integrity, as he did well with his master, with all that his master put into his care, verses 2 through 6, and in not sinning against God in verse 9. A man of integrity. But he was falsely accused and then placed in prison. But even there, positioned in prison, but then ultimately forgotten. As we read in Genesis chapter 40 and verse 20 to chapter 41 verse 1. On the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants, and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. And yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And after 2 years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And we go on, the 2 dreams that the Pharaoh had reflecting the famine that was to come. Joseph there with the butler, the chief baker, and the cupbearer, and had interpreted their dreams and told the cupbearer, when you're restored, remember me. But he forgot him, at least for 2 years. Positioned in prison, but then forgotten. And so we see that Joseph lived, but then he was providentially placed in power over Egypt. As we see in verses 40 to 44, when he interpreted the Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh wanted to put a wise man who was wiser than he to be put in charge. And so we read there, "You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will you be greater than me, or will I be greater than you?" And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, "Bow the knee." And thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." Wow. the dreams of Joseph coming true. Joseph lived a life that was marked by seeming setbacks. As we see from Genesis 41 to 50, as verse 50 we know, or verse 46 there, chapter 4, we know that by the age of 30, he was where God had planned for him to be. At the age of 30, the text there tells us that he entered into the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph then went in and out, went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land. His presence in Egypt also meant, though he was placed into the service of Pharaoh, but he's actually in the service of God, as his presence in Egypt also meant the salvation of the family that he had left behind in Egypt, or left behind in Canaan. Something not known through his life's ups and downs, but which ultimately became clear to him as time went on. As you look back on his life, as we see in Genesis 45, verses 4 through 8, and instructing his brothers to bring his father and the rest of the family there. And as we see, this was a part of God's plan in preserving life, as the text there says, as he's talking to his brothers in chapter 45, and verses 4 through 8. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father of Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." What a perception. And looking at what the fullness of God's plan had been, rather than striking out against his brothers. He had been surrendered to God's plan as a servant of God. Genesis 50, 19 to 21, we read, "But Joseph said to them, 'Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones.' Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them." This was following the death of his father, and his brothers felt now Joseph was going to take things into his own hands and take revenge upon them. Oh, what a story we see here in the life of Joseph. A life marked by twists and turns and even unfairness. We see Joseph, who went from pest to his brothers, to the pit, to Potiphar, to prison, and ultimately to power. And Joseph rode those ups and downs in his life. He went with the flow of things that he could not change. That reminds me of the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. That's the part that is often recited, but the full original copy of the Serenity Prayer by Reinhold Niebuhr, who lived from 1892 to 1971, is this: "God, give us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, the sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right, if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life, and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. Whoa, what a focus to have in going through life. But we see that Joseph remained focused on God. He held to his integrity and did his best wherever he was and whatever he was doing. Rooted in God, may our faith also in God be nurtured to bloom wherever it is that we might be planted, wherever we are in life. But also note how Stephen, right prior to Stephen being stoned to death, as he gave those who were striking out against him, who were opposing his teaching, gave them a little bit of a history lesson. That history lesson included an account of Joseph's life. And in talking about Joseph, in Acts chapter 7, verses 9 through 10, we read this. And the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt, but God was with him and rescued him out of all his afflictions and gave him favor and wisdom before Pharaoh, king of Egypt, who made him ruler over Egypt and over all his household. See, here looking back at Joseph's life, Stephen acknowledges that he was not spared his afflictions or trials, but God was with him through them and delivered him ultimately from those things. We need to recognize how the stuff of life is something we are passing through as we're going on toward the eternity that God has in mind for us. There are things of which we may not be spared, but through which our faith is enabled to shine in ways that it would not be possible otherwise. So let us consider 5 lessons to take to heart from the life of Joseph. First of all, let us take comfort that we are not in the place of God. Let him be the judge and the exerciser of vengeance in this world. Secondly, even when those closest to us mistreat us, let that not stop us from striving to do our best anyway. And thirdly, regardless of what the world might tempt us with or lead us toward, let us firmly hold to our integrity as children of God. And fourth, let us not waste energy on holding grudges, but remain willing to forgive, leaving the past in the past. Besides being kind to his brothers, even after coming into power in Egypt, Joseph did not consider it payback time, either against Potiphar's wife for having lied, or the chief cupbearer for having forgotten about him for 2 years, or toward his brothers for having treated him the way that they had. And fifth, even the evil done to us in this life may provide the opportunity for us to be placed in a position of greater service to the glory of God. Are we trusting him in that? We may not see it at the time, however, let us learn to trust God, leading us through whatever we are experiencing to where he is leading us, to where he wants us, to where he ultimately is going to place us in life. As we humble ourselves, he will do the exalting in our life. So are we trusting God through life's varied moments? Regardless of how things might seem at the moment, let us come to know, as Paul encouraged in Romans 8:28, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Now, Paul here didn't say that all things are good, but that God could work all things for good. Even the tough situations we're going through, the trials, even the bad experiences of life in this realm, God can work those things for good in ways that at the moment we might never even imagine. In spite of what may not be clear to us, let us remember that God remains at work on our behalf and in our life. May our trust remain resting in him through life's varied challenges, knowing that ultimately it is his purposes that are going to prevail. And so let us surrender ourselves to being used by God wherever we are, that when life is puzzling, let us look to God and trust him to bring all the pieces of life together and to bring us to where He wants us to be.